it's really nice to be back in this space again. It's been quite a few years since before the 2020 pandemic. So it's good to be here. I was like, oh yes, this is a beautiful space up here, beautiful place up here. And it's a beautiful day too. So glad to be with you all this morning. I guess it's still morning. So let me do my share screen here. There we go. All right. Is there a way to close this out or minimize this? No. All right. Sharing just the app or the whole screen? That's a good. Let me stop share and then try again. Just bear with. Okay. Optimize. No. All right. Yeah. Oops. No. Oh no, that's all.
Oh, that's better.
Yep, much better. Stash it in the corner. There you go. All right. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for helping out. There's always going to be some kind. Oh, it might go away in a second. Yeah. Okay. Just don't touch the computer. Okay. So as I was saying, it's good to be here again. This is a presentation that variations of it I've shared a number of times, so maybe I'll zip a little bit quickly today and leave more time for questions because I know many people here and perhaps online as well may have seen variations of this, right? But also then for those who it's new to them. But since Upaya is located within the traditional homelands of Pueblo communities of New Mexico, it's been my honor and privilege to be able to share sort of a contextual PowerPoint that just provides some of that background, right? And then we'll have some time maybe for questions and answers at the end. And I'm not sure how that will work online, but we can get there when we get there. So as well, I was introduced, my name's Porter Swentzell. And the last time that I was with Upaya, I was a professor at the Institute of American Indian Arts. But since the last time I joined you all, I became the executive director of Pueblo Community School, which is our tribally controlled school at Santa Clara Pueblo. It's a dual language school, so it's Tewa language and English, right? So that was sort of the background on that. And as mentioned, today is the last day of school. So as I drove away from the school this morning, there was all the kids were running utter mayhem, right? So I say, I'm receiving text messages every few minutes or so of updates of what's transpired. A lot of things can transpire when you have a bunch of pre-K through sixth graders, right? So, but it's a very fulfilling job. So, and a good way to serve our community and contribute back. So, when I introduce myself also, let me see if I can, I guess I have to go like this. There we go. I always like to give credit to my teachers, of course, my mom who's sitting here in this room, and also those that came before me, right? But those are just some of my many teachers over my life, right? But also I like to reinforce with my students at the school, say that a lot of times that we think of like in a school setting that your teachers are your those people that hold a PED license, right? Who are licensed teachers, right? But all of us are surrounded by teachers every day, right? And so all of us also are teachers, right? So we're sharing knowledge every day through our interactions with other people. But part of that traditional teaching that comes from the beginning of time is also the recognition that our teachers are not just other people as well, but the teachers are also the hills, the mountains, the trees, the birds, the plants, all of them are also our teachers as well. So that's what is passed down through time, right? That all these things are also our teachers, right? Not just the people as well, right? And so it's growing up at Santa Clara Pueblo, there's an image on the right-hand side of what it looked like about almost 100 years ago. And that's the roof of, on the right-hand side, the roof of the family home with a bunch of crops on it. And then roughly the same view today of the original plaza of the village. So it's a place where we've been living at for maybe at least about 400 to 500 years. And of course, going back in time, we have our oral tradition of the villages that we built going back, back and back and back. So this place as well, and then of course where I grew up specifically is about maybe half a mile away up the creek from this original center of the village. But this is like this is ground zero of the center of the world, right? So the rest of the world just revolves around this center place, right? And so this has been like, where we continue to have the center of our community and a lot of our practices and things like that, right? So that's Santa Clara Pueblo. And so those of you that are not familiar with this word Pueblo and Santa Clara Pueblo and Pueblo country and where you're at, sitting within the traditional homelands, I just sort of provide a little bit of the background on who and what are Pueblos, right? And so, but before getting into that, to even contextualize further, right, is that, we are guided a lot in the modern day world by these imaginary dashed lines, right, that say this area is New Mexico and this area is Arizona and this is the United States and this is Mexico and on and so forth, right? But these imaginary lines are just, a modern sort of human imaginary item, right? And so, but what have really guided people going back for millennia is the natural environment, right? So, and of course, living in a desert, some of the most important sort of things to be aware of is the two major watersheds that make up the so-called Southwest. I always like to point out, the Southwest of what, right? That's a very US-centric sort of perspective on things, right? That in reality, because of the ways that the rivers flow, right, they start in the Rocky Mountains, and then there's two major watersheds, the Rio Grande watershed with its tributaries, that's on the right-hand side there, that flows out into the Gulf of Mexico. And then, of course, the Colorado and its many, many tributaries that flow out on and eventually reach into the Pacific, right? Or at least they used to, right? And so this is this has been a major formation of how people move through the landscape. So and the way that rivers are is like the natural pathway for how people have moved through these areas for countless generations, right? And so what people think of as the Southwest is really more like the north edge of everything that flows down to the south, right? So there's strong connections traditionally into Mexico, deep into Mexico, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Mentioned that it's a high desert, right? So, but with desert areas and then of course as you go southwards, you get into a low desert environment, but all the way up into the mountains and the mountainous terrain with all the ecological zones that are involved with that. So that kind of contextualizes, okay, like this is the landscape. And of course, how people have resided within that landscape for countless generations, right? And so, of course, today there are a number of people that are sort of understood to be Pueblo communities. This is a rough map showing that within the context, the majority of Pueblo communities today reside within the watershed of the Rio Grande and its tributaries. And so you can see that all these little black dots are contemporary Pueblo nations, right, in New Mexico. But also there's some very closely related relatives on the Hopi Mesas in Arizona, and of course their watersheds going into the Colorado side of things, right? But of course our traditional homelands have been for a very long time generally in what I call the Four Corners area or Southwest, right? So you kind of get a sense of that. There's also a Pueblo community in what is basically El Paso, Texas today, right? So that a group of Pueblo people who moved down into that area during the Pueblo Revolt period. So even though there's a bunch of us Pueblo communities, we're not just one people, right? Each of our communities is its own country or our own nation, right? And then furthermore, groups of our communities speak different languages that are very distinctive. So there's three languages that are related to each other: Tewa, Tiwa, and Towa. Okay, so you can see that the language that we speak at Santa Clara is orange color on the map. And so there's 6 villages in New Mexico that speak Tewa language and 1 in Arizona that speaks that language. And so the 6 is Okeowinge, Santa Clara, San Ildefonso, Nambe, Tesuque, Powaki, Pueblos. And then the other related language to Tewa is Tiwa, which there's a northern Tiwa and southern Tiwa. So that's the green color on the map. And so northern Tiwa is Taos and Picaris, and then the southern Tiwa is Sandia and Isleta. So now, even though there's the green and the orange, right, it's important to note that every village has its own dialect as well. Even immediately next to the village can be a very distinctive dialect. So, for example, the school where I work is dedicated to our community at Santa Clara Pueblo. We have students that are from other communities, staff who are from other communities, right? So, you know, one of my many things that I do every day, right? I'm the executive director, so I'm writing reports and doing all sorts of other stuff, right? But also I'm like, you know, admonishing kids sometimes when they're acting up and talking with parents. And every morning I'm out there greeting the kids and staff as they come in at 7:30 in the morning, right? And so I have the staff who are from different villages, right, immediately adjacent to our community. When our people from our community are coming, they always say "Sengitamo." That's just how they greet, right? But there'll be staff from other villages speak the same language as us, but they always customarily say "Waatamo." So "Sengitamo, Waatamo." So I'll be like, oh, there's the ones who are from Tesuque. They're coming in. Greet them in their fashion, right? And so on and so forth. So even though they speak the same language, there's different dialects, right? And that's really especially the case with the northern Tiwa and the southern Tiwa, where the northern and south are quite different from each other, even though it's considered the same language. And then our other relative, Towa, which is sort of like the light blue color, is one village, Jemez Pueblo. They're the only ones that speak Towa. So Tiwa, Tewa, Towa, they're related to each other, but as far as linguists kind of think about it, right? But they will be related to each other. I like to use the example. They're related like Romanian, Italian, and Portuguese, right? So yeah, they had that root original language, right? But they're not really mutually intelligible anymore, right? And some are much more different than others, right? So, and then we have the light color, the light purple color, lavender, which is a Keres language, right? And there's 7 villages that speak that language: Cochiti, Santo Domingo, San Felipe, Santa Ana, Zia, Laguna, Acoma, and who am I missing here? Oh, Santo Domingo. I can't forget that. On here, on the map, is shown as Santo Domingo, Pueblo, which is also, they call themselves Skiwa. So each of these names are also either sometimes the Spanish saint name that was attributed at the time of colonization, and oftentimes otherwise corruption of the native name, usually corrupted a couple times over, right? Because you have maybe a native Spanish speaker trying to pronounce another name in another language, and then so it's kind of corrupted into how a Spanish speaker might try to say it, and then further corrupted by English speakers later on, right? And so there's some of the names are variations of that, right? So Keres, though, is a language isolate, so it's not known to be related to any other language in the world, right? So there's 7 villages that speak that language, not any other language in the world related to that language. And each of their villages have their own dialect. And then there's especially the eastern versus western clusters of lavender is even more dramatically different from each other, almost nearly unintelligible between those two clusters. Then there's kind of there's a Zuni language, which is spoken by Zuni Pueblo, which is right there by the New Mexico-Arizona border there. And Zuni is also a language isolate, also not known to be related to any other language, right? So and completely, entirely different than any of the other language, right? And then there's the villages that make up the Hopi, on the 3 mesas in Hopi, that they speak Hopi, and Hopi is related to the Uto-Aztecan language, right? So named by linguists. And that's a language family that has like all the way from Comanche, Shoshone, Paiute, Ute, down to Nawa, Mexica people in Mexico, and people all up and down, all the way from where modern day Mexico City is, all the way up into almost by Canada, right? So related to a bunch of other languages, not in any way, shape, or form related to the rest of the colors on the map, right? So even though like they call it pueblos, right, which is also a Spanish word, that is just sort of a label to talk about a whole group of people, right? And so even though we have a lot of diversity in terms of language, there's a lot of shared culture in terms of what does it mean to be farmers in a high desert environment, right? And so there's a lot of things that we share among our communities, right? And so part of it also is the building of permanent houses, right? Whether it's made out of adobe or stone. And I think the real tie-in is that all of those are put together with mud, right? So we build mud architecture, right? And so that's a key tie-in there. Being Lifeway centered around agriculture, especially planting corn and beans and squash, but corn being extremely influential with that. And then, of course, the kind of worldview that comes with living in the desert, planting corn, right? And so a lot of ceremonial religious worldview being shared, even if the languages are totally different from each other, right? And so in addition to that is what I like to call systems of care and responsibility that are very common, even if there's distinctive differences between each of the villages, right? Which is that in each each Pueblo person, no matter what kind of community that they come from, they have a very strong sort of cast of people supporting them, make sure that they behave and follow a certain life way, right? And so we see that even in my school today, right? We have maybe, a couple thousand people in our community, so we're not very big, right? But so my staff are also the uncles and aunts and godparents and other kinds of parents to the students, right? Just as we're going around in the school, we're addressing each other by these terms as well, right? By the roles that they hold in the village, right? And so that, it's a school and there's like a school board and all those sorts of things like that. But also as we're going through every day, we're recognizing how we're tied to each other, right? So that each person, they have their biological parents, but as they go through life, they will gain their parents who named them. As they move through the stages of life, then they may gain additional parents, right? And godparents, wedding parents, so on and so forth, right? And then also then as they go through life, right, the reverse happens where they start to gain additional kids. They could have biological kids, right? But then over time that they gain additional, and there's not really any difference in considering the biological versus all the other children that you gain as you go through life. So these systems of care and responsibility mean that as you're going around, there's a lot of eyes watching you, right? And then also you have things to look out for as well, right? And so, even just a couple of weeks ago, there was a set of parents that showed up at our house at Santa Clara, and they showed up from Jemez Pueblo asking me and my wife, who are in this picture with our wedding parents, right? So gained new parents when we got married. They came and asked us to serve as godparents to their son, right? So they crossed the mountains to Jemez Pueblo for like a whole weekend, 2 weekends ago, to fulfill that role, right? That responsibility. And so you gain another kid and gain many, many more family members, because everybody that's there, they become your relatives as well, right, through that process. So now I have a bunch of family in Jemez, right, that I didn't have a month ago, right? And in addition, so this is kind of these systems of responsibility and care, right? And of course, there's telling and reminding, whatever you do, you have to remember that your door is now open to all these people. Anytime that they come to ask for help, you make sure and help them out. The reverse is true too. Anytime that I might need help, now I have all these people that I can go to, right? And so I start to do that, right? And there's all these ties that start to happen, right? And then, of course, the telling of the history, I'm going to go in a little bit into the history side, but we have our own version of telling history, which is a place-based history, right? So when we're telling a story about all the things that happened in the past, we say, when we lived at such and such place. And then we have a whole chronology of the places we lived at going back into the beginning of time. So there's time when we came and emerged into this world, right? The village that we lived at that time, then the next village after that, and the next village after that, and the next one, 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 right? And so all of those villages, so in telling the story, said, at the time that we lived at such and such place, right? And so in this picture is the one village that we lived at immediately before the village that we live at now, right? Which is up on the mesa, Puje Owenge, right? Or Puye Cliff Dwellings, as you might be familiar with, which is a village that we lived at starting about maybe 800 years to about, 500 years ago, for a couple hundred years there, right? Which, to put it into perspective, is longer than the existence of the United States, right? So that was where we were at before we, oh no, it's going on. Okay, this should go away in a second, right? But to go into kind of more like that chronology of sort of that time frame, right? One of the things that you may have heard of before, and is sort of one of the things that is also very distinctive about this area, is because of the dry environment. The so-called Southwest is one of the birthplaces of archaeology, because of the way that things have preserved well, and also because of the kind of buildings that our forebears constructed, right? So they preserve very well over time, and especially if it's in a protected space, and the things in those areas preserve very well. So archaeology, many of the systems and methods and things like that come from this area and come from digging up our ancestral villages, right? And so this area has a very rich tradition in terms of archaeology, right? But and then archaeologists applied labels and come up with their theories about why things are the way they are, and it came up with labels for different sort of cultural areas. So you hear this sometimes, the word Anasazi, which is where it says ancestral pueblo, that's what it used to be called, as Anasazi, which is now been sort of shifted over to ancestral polo because the word Anasazi is sort of low-key offensive. And so, but the archaeologists apply these labels, right? But our stories still are telling our version of how things transpired in the past, right? But because of that rich archaeological tradition, some of the sort of key dates, and I'll just kind of hit on these briefly as we go through, but one of, of course, there's been evidence of people moving through this landscape for many, many millennia. And you may have seen the big news story just in southern New Mexico of footprints in the sandy beach, right, and near modern day Alamogordo in that area, right? And so you get, and those are like the tracks are like crossed by extinct animals and things like that, right, and dated to a very long time ago, right? And some of the oldest, Clovis points, Clovis, New Mexico, that's why it's named that, right? And so some of these things are connected with this area. But really the story that that really defines who Polo people are is with the emergence of agriculture, right? And so, and especially with corn, right? And as corn is its most closest relative is Teosinte, right? And that it came into being somewhere near the Central Valley of Mexico, perhaps the Rio Balsas Valley, in near modern day Mexico, in the general area of Mexico City. And so about maybe 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, right? And that's a tropical area down there, right? So how does a tropical grass show up in the high desert, right? Well, it takes a long time before that's possible, right? And so, one of the gifts is the jar with seeds in it, right? And as these seeds are making their way and transforming, the corn that was coming out of there is totally different than the corn that we see today because it's evolved over time, right? But also, so archaeologists and historians like to talk about the Neolithic revolution, which is a fancy word for people becoming farmers. And so also, like, one of the interesting parts of that is that becoming a farmer is not really necessarily if you did a cost-benefit analysis, it's not great, right? So one of the reasons why people typically have chosen not to become farmers is because that cost-benefit analysis is not great, right? And so, and it's a high risk, right? So you're looking at it in that terms. It's not really like, you're like, so you want to you want me to give up all the things that I've been highly successful at, right? As groups of people, right? Of not just surviving, but thriving on the land in a very successful, sustainable way, and basically put all my seeds in one basket, right? Literally kind of really dedicating to one particular, and if it fails, if grasshoppers show up, it's game over, right? And so hunter and gatherers all over the world, not just here, were like, that seems like a terrible idea, right? And so you can see like where farmers are coming into being. They have immediate neighbors who are like, meh, and then of course you can see that actually also farming oftentimes is not great for, it's not observable by people generally speaking, right? But like people who become farmers, like you can start to see in the archaeological record, their life expectancy declines. They grow shorter, they stop being as tall, right? All sorts of health problems. So like in the big scheme of things, you'd be like, why would someone do that, right? And so that's why it takes thousands of years. That's why you have this span, 4,000 to 1,800 years. So the first corn in this area is dated to 4,200 near modern day Zuni Pueblo, but there's not a lot of people are signing up 4,200 years ago, right? And people don't really start to get on board until about 1,800 years ago, right? But there's the other side of it. So that's the archaeology side of things, right? They're looking at, okay, how long does it take this tropical grass to move up? And what are the cost-benefit analysis going on? And why? How come all these hunter-gatherers don't want to just become farmers, right? So anyway, those are some of the challenges. But really the thing is that people weren't moving the seeds along in the same way that we might go to the feed store to get seeds or something like that. Or like, what plants grow in our zone and need 120 frost-free days, and what's the pH level of the soil, and so on and so forth. No, because wherever you see corn moving, a whole worldview travels with it, right? So it's people don't become farmers, they become converts. That's the way I think of it. And people don't domesticate corn, but corn domesticates people, right? It's the other way around, okay? And so that when people are bringing it, say, there's this sacred being, you can engage in a relationship with it. However, if you do, you must surrender everything you believe about the world and adopt all these new ideas. You must sing these songs. You must practice these traditions in order to be in a relationship with this being. Otherwise, it's not possible, right? Sorry, my computer's acting up. And so that's one of the sort of key elements there. And actually, I need to plug it in if it's going to keep going. I don't know. Let me pull this out. So, people were not doing how we would normally think of in terms of how one might adopt agriculture, right? Which is, oh, this is a great idea, and give my sales pitch on it. They're really like, probably almost like the sort of way to think about it is like, oh, okay, you're going to need to go through a full conversion to an entire different worldview, right? And so this is kind of the way that it travels. So wherever you see people are getting corn coming out of Mexico, out of the central area of Mexico, you're also seeing that people are changing the way that they engage with the world and everything that they do. And so that's the same in this area. When people become farmers, everything changes, okay? So a lot of things change. But it doesn't also mean that people just dedicate everything to growing corn, right? People are still very much engaged in gathering lifestyle, just as today we continue to have our times of the year where we gather wild spinach and gather these different plants. That's something that goes way back into the depths of time, right? People are doing the things that have made them successful, right? And then corn becomes, at first, is just a small part of that big picture, but becomes increasingly more important in terms of being part of that story. So let me, I'm going to have to go do the full thing here. Yeah, it died completely. So anyway, but so as also when you start becoming a farmer, one of the main things that happens as well is that you need to start to stay there and watch after crops, right? And so this is where you get the story of permanent houses. People focused on staying in this one particular place and living in one particular place. And so so you get the first architecture, which is basically what I call a pit house. So you're digging a hole in the ground and building a permanent place to live. And let me make sure that I have not, okay, turn that off. Okay, now forgive me, everybody. We're gonna go back to this. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And maybe I'll even be better than before. It's getting better. Let's try to do the presenter. Oh, that's looking pretty good. Okay. Down to one little black box. Okay. So as I mentioned, the start of pit house architecture about nearly 2,000 years ago, right? And over time, you'll notice that there's these storage cysts on like little basically mini pit houses to store crops in, right? Over time, these transform. So starting about 1300 years ago or so, these storage rooms slowly began to become above ground rooms on the side of the pit house, right? So the pit house is still like the main house, is still like the main place where people are at, but then there's these above ground storage rooms. Over hundreds of years, like it's hard to fully grasp the length of time, right? But then those on the side rooms become like the main rooms, and over time that pit house becomes more and more specialized. We still have that pit house in our communities today, right? So we have this original architecture, even with the elements, with the post holes and the deflector shield and the fire hearth and all the main elements, the wing walls that were necessary. So we have architecture in our current day villages that's like 2,000 years old, but over time it's transitioned more and more and become more and more specialized, right? And a big part of that, which is sort of famous as one of the postcard places, is Chaco Canyon, which you may have heard of, which about 1,000 years ago really blossomed into this major sort of building and cultural phenomena, right? That was very impactful in the region at large, right? And then, of course, in the sort of the time frame of immediately following that, what many of you have probably maybe even visited or be familiar with is Mesa Verde, again, postcard image here, which is very famous because of the buildings being constructed within large caves, right? So it preserves the architecture very well, right? So, it kind of stands out. Although the villages at Mesa Verde are kind of small in comparison to the much larger villages that were near modern day Cortez, Colorado, right? And then starting about 740 years ago, there are major migrations out of that region, out of the Mesa Verde and the San Juan Basin area. And so you can see the map there, where people are moving down into basically where Pueblo communities are today. So, and that's what our stories talk about as well, moved out of those areas, right? So, and in the years between about 700 and 480 years ago, that there's an increase in the number of villages in modern day New Mexico and Arizona, and the much larger villages, and even before that, are more sort of organized along certain patterns. So this is just one example, which is Pecos Pueblo, which is not too far from where we're sitting right now, and the artist's rendition of what it may have looked like about 500-600 years ago. And so you have sort of these plaza-centric villages with the pit houses are still there, better known as kivas, which is just a Hopi word for those structures. Each of our languages has our own word, right? And then room blocks, multi-story room blocks surrounding that. So that's pretty classic. And then there was a bunch of those, right? So around the time that the Spanish invaded New Mexico in 1540, the first time, and then came to stay in 1598, there was about 100 Pueblo nations in New Mexico, with perhaps about 100,000 people in those communities, right? So many of these, about 100 of these, right? Some big, some small, some much bigger. And so, of course, in 1540, there was an initial invasion into the area, looking for riches and so on and so forth. But then that was financially unfeasible. And so there was a lapse in the story of colonization until 1598, when a group of settlers were brought up to permanently establish a colony in New Mexico. And that had some financial struggles, and that's a whole story and stuff. I usually tell this whole story over an entire semester when I'm talking about this. Like a lot of details I'm kind of skimming over. But of course, there was significant, the imposition of colonialism also then transitioned more into the imposition of the missionary project of the Franciscan order of the Catholic Church, right? And so the building of massive mission complexes within Pueblo communities, and the renaming of those communities based on a patron saint. So Pueblo de Santa Clara we're the village of St. Clair, right? And our patron saint, and the Franciscans, of course, they all pick their favorite saints. And St. Clair was one of the original followers of St. Francis, right? And so she was very popular. And all the other Pueblo names, generally their saint names, are the favorite list, the short list of the Franciscans, right? But you won't see too many favorites of the Jesuits or Dominicans or any of the other orders, because that's the way it rolls, right? So they had their territories, right? So depending on which territory, you can see all the favorite saints in that area, right? So that's how you can tell who is in that area, right? And so there was significant conflict in that first 100 years, and really culminating all throughout many revolts. But the most famous in 1680, the majority of Pueblo communities rose up and ejected the Spanish entirely from New Mexico, right? So one of the few times, and it's usually highlighted because of the United States, but in Mexico, it's key to note that there are many other examples of indigenous revolts that entirely ejected colonial powers for even longer lengths of time at the same time as the Pueblos were also that we were doing that. And so a lot of the conflict was centered around the imposition of the mission program, right? So of course the colonial project returned to New Mexico in 1692, but because of that ejecting of the colonial powers, the relationship changed in the years after that, right? And so it's a little bit more of a middle ground area, right? So this is a mural, just a piece of the mural by the former, he's passed away now, but Michael Caboti, Hopi painter, painted this big mural at NAU, and this little section is depicting that time period of conflict, right? And sort of the disruption. One of the key elements to that, though, is that in 1598, we say there was about 100 Pueblo communities with about 100,000 people. In 1706, 108 years later, there were 17 Pueblo communities with 6,440 inhabitants. So that is a population decline of 90-ish%, right? And then a decline in the number of nations by about 80-some%, right? There was less villages in 1706 than there are now. Okay, so we increased the number of villages since then. And so we say, what society in the world would experience a demographic catastrophe like that and still come to exist, right? Still maintain who they are, right? So I always like to use the examples like that are usually highlighted for demographic collapse, like the Black Death in the 1300s, right? And they're like, in some places, 30% of the population died and society came apart, right? Like the world, vast areas were abandoned and vacant, and the buildings and towns were empty, right? Or the 30 Wars years, the next few centuries later, where in parts of Germany 50% of the population died in the 30 Years' War. Utter and complete demographic collapse, right? In parts of southern Germany. And you say, that pales in comparison to losing 90% of your people, right? How does any society do that and still have language, culture, traditions still residing in our current day villages? And we go back to those systems of care and responsibility, right? If each individual has not just one or two parents, but they have 12 parents, right? You could lose 90% of your parents and still have parents, right? If each person had not just their biological kids, but many more kids, right? If they die out, if their biological parents die, they still have parents, right? On and so forth. They have people to care for them and make sure that all this knowledge continues to be passed on. So it's a form of social technology that's amazingly robust. So robust that it overrides a 90% demographic catastrophe, right? A loss of that many people, right? And so those systems are not just oh, that's a cool way that people organize themselves. But it's a social technology that is immensely resilient against these impositions, right? So, but also I always like to point out that part of the wisdom of those who came before us also is to utilize these systems, the colonial systems, and use them for our own purposes. And not only just use them for our own purposes, but use them to actually battle against those systems, right? So maintaining agency in a profound and creative fashion, right? So that the Catholic churches come to be actually systems that reinforce our traditional customs and values and so on our terms rather than on their terms, right? So I mentioned becoming a godparent is like a Catholic kind of thing, right? But it has this massive traditional overlay on it that actually creates a new way to add additional relatives, additional links, and make you even more resilient against those impositions, right? Just as when the Spanish came in, they didn't really recognize our local traditional forms of governance, right? So they say, oh, well, when we come to a village, we want to have a governor, a lieutenant governor, a sheriff, so on and so forth, right? So we adopted that. But that system of governance is in our language, the terms that are used for those individuals represent our original form of government, right? Our ancient form of government. So it's just utilized. And then those individuals receive canes from the crown, which we still carry today. You can see our governor. It's our current governor still yet. This is pictures from last year. By carrying the canes distributed by the kings of Spain and the Mexican government, Abraham Lincoln, the crown prince came and gave us some more some years ago, and New Mexico as well. That they gave the canes of power to demonstrate that we are a nation unto ourselves, right? And to use that against the colonial powers itself, right? So you can see all throughout the historical records, because they had the stamp on there, right? Saying they were our governors hundreds of years ago, right? They go to Santa Fe and they bring and say, we are direct vassals of the King of Spain. You must remove those sheep from our fields because we are higher rank than the local Hispano settlers, because we are direct vassals. We don't answer to the viceroy, we answer to the king himself. And they say, you're right. Remove the sheep, they must pay you back. And so I protected our lands and maintained our land base through these systems, using it because they had a lawyer in the Casas Reales, the royal houses in Santa Fe, that was dedicated to serving us, because you have your lawyer and you say like, hey, we have our paperwork, and we say we're the direct vassals of the king. And so even today, like this image is from our from the installation of our officers on January 6th, All Kings Day. And last year they sat me as a tribal official, so you can see I'm in there as well. And on that day you assume office, and that's moving forward for that your service to the community. And so I say, even to this day, that you now go to work for as those in that role, right? Going language that echoes back hundreds of years, right? And using it to maintain our identity as communities, right? And so, you know, these are also part of in our communities today. We have our annual feast days, which is on our saint days that were dedicated to our patron saint. And so we have those. Every village has usually their main patron saint, but also many other saint days throughout the year. And we have used that calendar of saint days for our own purposes, right? And so to continue to celebrate those traditions that came with corn, really, in many ways, on those days, right? So especially coming up now, we're getting ready, right, at this time now for a very important day at Santa Clara, which is in celebration of Saint Anthony, San Antonio, right, June 13th. There's an image there of him painted in a traditional style with even Pueblo pottery designs around it, right? And June 13th is very close to the summer solstice, right? And so there's many communities that venerate Saint Anthony San Antonio because that's the time of year, celebrate him very, very much, right? And also do all the things that we need to do at that time of year. Easter is almost always near the vernal equinox, right? So it lines up with all those other things. Christmas is very conspicuously lined up with the winter solstice in a very nice, convenient way, right? And so there's many, many of these dates that line up very perfectly. So you say, were we, and sometimes I think of this when I'm sitting in mass, right? Because of the way things unfold. I say, was that missionary project successful, or did we just counter missionize and override that system, right? And say, actually, that's cool. We agree. However, you're going to do it our way. So thank you. And so that's kind of the way that that's unfolded in many of the communities, right? So, and so if you have the opportunity to get invited to one of those feast days, they happen throughout the year. And so it's a time that outside people are often invited to come and watch, get a sort of small glimpse of what goes on in our communities, of the feasting that goes on, of the traditional dances, and of the merging of these worldviews, right? They'll have their, bring the saint out and process them. They build a house for them to stay at the day to watch the dances as well, right? And to celebrate that and carry on these things that go through time, right? So, you know, one of the other key things to think about as well is that we've had not just the original colonial invaders, but new invaders in the 1840s that the Americans came and invaded. And we joined with the local Hispano populations to battle against the Americans invading. And in fact, the Americans bombarded Taos Pueblo during those battles as well, right? And the Americans brought a very distinct and different flavor. I think of colonialism like Baskin Robbins, right? There's like 31 flavors at Baskin Robbins, right? There's 31 flavors of colonialism. They're all different, right? Still colonialism, but they're different flavors, and some are quite maybe somewhat better tasting than others, I guess. And so American colonialism is very distinctive and a very different flavor of the 31 flavors. And they brought that flavor here to New Mexico as well. And a big part of that is the industrial boarding schools that were constructed, and specifically some of the very first ones here in New Mexico, right? That to pass along that sort of way of colonialism, which was radically different than what had followed before, right? And so that is part of that story of colonialism and the engagement with tribes. You know, I'm not going to get into some of these periods of federal Indian law, right, in too much detail because of time. But you know, even to this day, a big part of my job is, you know, as a tribally controlled school, one of the things that the federal government does is say, okay, through something called Public Law 104, PL 104, say, all right, we're going to allow you tribes to self-determine how you're going to run things on your own. We're not going to tell you too much about how to do that, right? And so we'll give you the money and you get to run things on your own. Right? So cool. Sounds like a good plan, right? So my school is a PL 104 school. So they say, we'll give you the money we would have used to run a Bureau of Indian Education school, right? And then you guys run it, right? It's like, oh, awesome. Right? Let's do this, right? And so, but then they're like, but these are federal funds. So there's assurances that the federal government requires that are tagged with those funds, right? So they're like, we'll give you the money and you can run your school. However, with this money, you can buy blue strawberries, all right? So they say, you know, but it's up to you where you source your blue strawberries and exactly when you buy your blue strawberries and how many blue strawberries. You're like, but I don't need blue strawberries, right? Our mission as a tribal school is not involved with blue strawberries. And we're like, well, that's tough because this is blue strawberry money, right? And that's how sort of the funding works, right? And so those are part of the impositions of colonialism that exist to this day that I deal with on a daily basis, right? So big part of my job is continuing that struggle that stretches back into the beginning of time and continuing to deal with those impositions, not only the struggles that our forebears had in terms of overcoming every kind of challenge that we face, and every generation has faced challenges, right? But to look at how we might continue to carry on the story of who we are so that those that come after us might not say, how come those ones that lived at this time in this moment, they gave up on us, right? And now we have nothing, right? So the story of who we are stretching back thousands of years ended with them because they threw up their hands and didn't do their job, right? And now it's our turn in this time and age to do our best to continue on who we are and carrying that forward, right? And so, and dealing with the continuing impositions. Colonialism isn't something that happened in 1540. It's not something that happened in 1598, 1680, 1846, or any of those. It's something that happens right now with the way that funding is delivered and the way that the rigidity, they say we're a dual language school. They give us a lot of money to run a school, but they give us $30,000 for language and culture. So I can hire half a Tewa language teacher with that, right? So you can see by the way that monies are delivered that assimilation project is still ongoing, right? They say, who cares if you value language and culture? We certainly don't, because the way that you fund organizations also is a moral act, right? So they're demonstrating their moral sensibilities through the way that they divvy out the money, right? And therefore they're demonstrating to everybody, this is what we value is the same things as these boarding schools going back into time, right? That we're continuing to care about that, right? So it's my job to make sure that we can overcome those impositions, just as our Parikain, the ones who came before us, also overcame those, right? And so, but it's just our turn now. So I know we may not have too much time, but I'm open to a few questions. I know we're supposed to start up on the next one.
Thank you. That was so powerful. Porter, thank you so much. It is so powerful to actually have you trace the historical, cultural, but also the political arc, and also that corn as an organizing aspect, major organizing aspect of how we relate to culture, society, our children, and to the earth. And one of the things that really I'm so moved about is the your last words, that the struggle for external autonomy. You have internal autonomy, but for external autonomy is still going on. And we have a social responsibility to be aware of it and also to address the oppressive forces that are forcing you to allocate funds for the blue strawberry world. So I thank you so much for bringing that to our attention, because issues related to structural violence are addressed. Many of the people on with us today are chaplain candidates, are people who are, being trained in the service sector to work in prisons and schools and hospitals and so on. But one of the issues that we address in that chaplaincy training has to do with directly calling out institutional and structural violence and taking responsibility for transforming the systems that are causing suffering. So I just thank you so much for bringing that to our attention.
So do we have a little bit of time for some questions? Are we pretty close? May we have a few questions from the wider community and maybe one or two from in here?
Sure.
Great. And then we know you have to go.
And I think the next presenter too.
So Koda will help us from the wider community, from the online Sangha. And let Koda recognize you. Then we go right inside to hear. Please. Please.
And in the stories that are told about once we lived on this land and then we went to this land, in those stories, is there anything said about, the reason for the moving? Was it weather? Was it drought? Was it some other cause? Or is that not part of the narrative? I always like to know what makes humans need to move from one settled place to another.
Yeah, and that's something that archaeologists, that's a standing question, right? That the archaeologists always have is, well, how come people move from here to there, right? And looking for, and there's kind of a joke that archaeologists can find a drought for everything, because if you look at the climate pattern of climate, there's there's a lot of instability even long ago as well, right? So you can always find some kind of event that would be like, oh, this is the cause, right? But in some ways that could be maybe seen as a little offensive because it removes human agency, right, from the equation, right? And so, also it removes the way that people perceive, all around the world, people have perceived the relationship between themselves and their places very differently, right? And so they say, like, there's a whole argument about whether climate change is anthropogenic or not, right? And I think that's pretty clear what that is, right? And so, but I don't, part of that worldview is that it's all anthropogenic. So if bad stuff is happening to you, it's your fault, right? Like if there's floods or something, it's reflecting on you as a community and the poor behavior as people, right? So that was not really ever an issue in that sense. So I say, did a drought cause people to move? Possibly, right? Did people think, oh, it's a La Nina effect going on right now, and we really need to leave because the pattern's not looking great, right? They're like, oh, people are not praying the right way. They're not living their life in a correct manner. Something is terribly awry, and therefore we need to relocate to another place, right? So it could look like the same thing, but also it could look pretty different, right? So even in the archaeological record, there's huge lengths of time where there's massive droughts and people don't move, right? But then you could find a drought for every time that someone did move, right? But was that the actual cause, or was there a lot of other possible? So a lot of other things. In the traditional stories, sometimes that reason is given and sometimes it's not, but it's usually not saying not in those terms. So archaeologists telling one story is very different than a story told, right?
Thank you. There was one couple online here. So Hannah, I'm going to unmute you. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Porter. Lovely to hear you speak again. I'm learning this story as I hear it over and over. And I think I asked something like this last year, and I don't remember the answer. I know that often when we look at traditional societies, like I had this experience in looking at West Africa, the Europeans would come in and they would see the roles of men very easily because in Europe, that was a patriarchal society. And they failed to notice the roles of women, which were less obvious, like the chief's mother and the role of markets that permeated the whole culture and that women ran. So I'm looking at your slide program and I'm seeing that most of the photographs are of men and also the colonial roles are of men. So could you help us see clearly more the roles of women in passing on the culture and sharing influence and power?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question in terms of like also some of the most visible roles, right? Visibility versus, I guess I don't want to say invisibility, right? You know, so traditional sort of gender roles in terms of our communities, right? And where if an outside person, who are they most likely to see, right? And engage with, right? So that provides that bias as well, right? But so, for example, I have a picture of tribal officials, like by the customary rules. So for a good example, there's a customary rules is that they're supposed to be of a certain age, and they should be, though that's not the case today always, but they should be married, because it's impossible for, I shouldn't say impossible, I have to be careful how I say this, but they're not supposed to be able to do that job without their partner, right? So that job is them and their partner, because they become, when they get in that role, they become the mom and dad to the village, right? And so just as there's a mom and dad to the whole village, like mom and dad in the family, right? That they each have their job that they have to do, right? So each of them as the moms and dads, everybody becomes their kids, right? So on that day, after you get put into that seat, right? Then you go back home and feast, right? And people come all day long and give you that advice, right? And they give it to the family in the house, right? And they give it to the couple as a whole, because now your house becomes public property, right? Your house is now open. And so you have to be prepared to welcome visitors in all of the different roles that both sides have, right? And so those are some of the things that you don't see, right? In the usual, like, especially from the Western outside lens, right? But that men often serve in those visible roles because of the particular roles that they have, right? So it ends up being more visible. They're standing on guard duty outside the village. So who are you going to run into? Some guy standing on guard duty, but who's in charge of the house? The ladies are, right? And so they're the ones that are really always have a huge part, but it's not as visible, right? And so, of course, also you have, I'm not going to get into the whole diversity of how, say, for example, we have our clans, our lineages, right? And how those are passed along, and how that role plays a huge part of it, right? So even, say, for example, welcoming a new godchild, right? Who's in charge of all of those roles, right? So all of that's huge, but the outside person's not going to see all of this immense roles, right?
Where I want to be sensitive to time, but I just want to mention that something that Liz Ritoli put in the chat. She said, the first photos you showed were your teachers, and they were mostly women. Yep. And I think that is a point well taken in terms of what you've just reflected. And Hannah, I think you get that. And then I think one other question that I think is really important in relation to issues related to structural violence, also in the chat. Can I hear what is being done? This is from Gene Stevens, for peace via New Mexico Pueblos and on nuclear weapons proliferation with money for plutonium pit production at Llano, et cetera. And if you could just, since San Ildefonso is so affected and, others are so affected, if you could just reflect for a minute on this, and then I know you have to go, but I think it's really important to hear your voice on this.
Yeah, and I probably not, maybe not the right person to talk to specifically, because there are some nonprofit groups that are very dedicated to this issue and looking at it. One from Santa Clara, Hope honoring our Pueblo existence, right? And the partnerships that they have focus on that. And I guess one of the bigger picture as well is that the National Laboratory is a massive employer, right? And so there are many, many people from the communities that also work there, right? And so there's kind of this tension that exists, right? In all sorts of areas in northern New Mexico, right? Because major employer, right? And they're like, oh, we're going to do increased plutonium pit production. That means, 1,500 new jobs or whatever, the number is, that we're going to be adding in on this. And so people are kind of stepping carefully around that issue, right? Because then there's people that from the own community, including relatives of myself, that's their job that they've done. That's where they work, right? And so that's their livelihood. But at the same time, there's this incredible imposition in a traditional landscape, especially in northern New Mexico, right? And on the contamination of that landscape, basically, what I've heard it referred to is, they're built, this poison camp in our cathedral, right? And so the impact of that, right? How they say, so what if it's a major employer, right? If it has these ill effects, right? So that's about what I could say about that. But I would say there's other people who have strong dedication to fighting on this issue, right? And so it's more in their space to talk about that because they've been doing the work.
Thank you so much, Porter.
Thank you so much, Porter. I really thank you for a stimulating, invigorating, and important ancient and quite modern presentation. We're extremely grateful for you making the journey to this temple. Thank you. I would like to invite us to, as we make a transition, just stand as a community. It's a respectful way to thank our speaker. Just stand, spreading feet apart, really find your base. And if at home, for our online community, if you would like to stand, that would be a wonderful gift. And let's enjoy 3 deep and full breaths, taking in the breath of life and gratitude and releasing. And again, in whatever deep and genuine way, taking in everything we've heard. And breathing out gratitude and compassion. And one more time. Thank you very much, everyone. We want to continue. We're going to have Roxanne Porter come up and take her place. Excuse me. That was a really interesting. We're going to invite Roxanne Swentzell to come and sit in her son's seat, and we'll take a few minutes of transition. I know we want to follow Porter, but let's allow him to exit and have his mother come forward. And please stay put.